I am to yield Britain back to her gods, Arthur said, mocking the duty by the tone of his voice. You will, Lord, I said. He shrugged. Merlin wanted a strong arm to hold a good sword, he said. But what the gods want, Derval, I do not know. If they want Britain, why do they need me? Or Merlin? Do gods need men? Or are we like dogs barking for masters who don't want to listen? We aren't dogs, I said. We're the creatures of the gods. They must have a purpose for us. Must they? Maybe we just make them laugh. Merlin says we've lost touch with the gods, I said stubbornly. Just as Merlin has lost touch with us, Arthur said firmly. You saw how he ran from Dunovaria that night you returned from Innistribes. Merlin's too busy, Derval. Merlin is chasing his treasures of Britain, and what we do in Dumnonia is of no consequence to him. I could make a great kingdom for Mordred. I could establish justice. I could bring peace. I could have Christians and pagans dancing in the moonlight together. And none of that would interest Merlin. Merlin only yearns for the moment when all of it is given back to the gods. And when that moment comes, he'll demand I give Caledfulk back to him. And that was his other condition. I could take the sword of the gods, he said, so long as I gave it back when he needed it. He had spoken with a trace of mockery that had disturbed me. Don't you believe in Merlin's dream? I asked. I believe Merlin is the wisest man in Britain, Arthur said seriously, and that he knows more than I might ever hope to know. I also know that my fate is twisted into his, just as yours, I think, is twisted into Nemui's. But I also think that Merlin was bored from the moment he was born. So Merlin is doing what the gods do. He's amusing himself at our expense. Which means, Derval, that when the moment comes to return Caledfulk, it will be at a time when I need the sword most. So what will you do? I've no idea. None. He seemed to find that thought amusing, for he smiled, then put a hand on my shoulder. Go and sleep, Derval. I need your tongue tomorrow, and I don't want it slurred by tiredness. I left him, and somehow I did snatch a few moments' sleep in the moon-cast shadow of a looming stone, though before I slept I lay thinking about that far-off night when Merlin had made Arthur's arm ache with the weight of the sword, and his soul heavy with the greater burden of fate. Why had Merlin chosen Arthur, I wondered? For it seemed to me now that Arthur and Merlin were opposed. Merlin believed that chaos could only be defeated by harnessing the powers of mystery, while Arthur believed in the powers of men. It could be, I thought, that Merlin had trained Arthur to rule men so as to leave himself free to rule the dark powers. But I also realized, however dimly, that the moment might come when we would all have to choose between them. And I feared that moment. I prayed it would never come. Then I slept until the sun rose to lance the shadow of a single stone pillar that stood isolated outside the circle, straight into the very heart of the stones, where we tired warriors guarded a kingdom's ransom. We drank water, ate hard bread, then buckled on our swords before spreading the gold on the dew-wet grass beside the altar stone. "What's to stop Egil taking the gold and continuing his war?" I asked Arthur, as we waited for the Saxons' arrival. Egil, after all, had taken gold from us before, and that had not stopped him from burning Dura Brevis. Arthur shrugged. He was wearing his spare armour, a coat of Roman mail that was dented and scarred from frequent fights. He wore the heavy mail under one of his white cloaks. "Nothing," he answered, "except what little honour he might have, which is why we might have to offer him more than gold." "More?" I asked. But Arthur did not reply, because on the dawn-blazoned eastern skyline, the Saxons had appeared. They came in a long line spread across the horizon, with their war drums beating and their spearmen arrayed for battle, though their weapons were tipped by leaves to show that they meant us no immediate harm. Egil led them. He was the first of the 2 men I ever met who claimed the title of Bretwalda. The other came later, and was to give us more trouble. But Egil was trouble enough. He was a tall man with a flat, hard face and dark eyes that revealed none of his thoughts. His beard was black, his cheeks were scarred from battle, and 2 fingers were missing from his right hand. He wore a coat of black cloth that was belted with leather, boots of leather, an iron helmet on which bull horns were mounted, and over it all a bearskin cloak that he dropped when the heat of the day became too much for such a flamboyant garment. His banner was a blood-daubed bull's skull held aloft on a spear shaft. His warband numbered 200 men, maybe a few more, and over half those men had great war dogs leashed with leather ropes. Behind the warriors was a horde of women, children, and slaves. There were more than enough Saxons to overwhelm us now, but Egil had given his word that we were at peace, at least until he had decided our fate, and his men made no hostile show. Their line stopped outside the circling ditch, while Egil, his council, an interpreter, and a pair of wizards came to meet Arthur. The wizards had hair stiffened into spikes with dung, and wore ragged cloaks of wolfskin. When they whirled around to say their charms, the legs, tails, and faces of the wolves flared out from their painted bodies. They shouted those charms as they came closer, nullifying any magic we might be working against their leader. Nimue crouched behind us and chanted her own counter-charms. The 2 leaders weighed each other up. Arthur was taller than Egil, broader. Arthur's face was striking, but Egil's was terrifying. It was implacable, the face of a man who had come from beyond the sea to carve out a kingdom in a strange land. And he had made that kingdom with a savage and direct brutality. "I should kill you now, Arthur," he said, "and have 1 less enemy to destroy." His wizards, naked beneath their moth-eaten skins, crouched behind him. One chewed a mouthful of earth, the other rolled his eyes, while Nimue, her empty eye socket bared, hissed at them. The struggle between Nimue and the wizards was a private war that the 2 leaders ignored. "The time will come, Egil," Arthur said, "when maybe we shall meet in battle. But for now I offer you peace." I had half expected Arthur to bow to Egil, who was, unlike Arthur, a king, but Arthur treated the Bretwalda as an equal, and Egil accepted the treatment without protest. "Why?" Egil asked bluntly. Egil used no circumlocutions like we British favoured. I came to notice that difference between ourselves and the Saxons. The British thought in curves, like the intricate whorls of their jewellery, while Saxons were blunt and straight, as crude as their heavy gold brooches and chunky neck chains. Britons rarely broached the subject headlong, but talked around it, wrapping it with hints and allusions, always looking for manoeuvre. But Saxons thrust subtlety aside. Arthur once claimed I had that same Saxon straightforwardness, and I think he meant it as a compliment. Arthur ignored Egil's question. "I thought we had peace already. We had an agreement sealed with gold." Egil's face betrayed no shame at having broken the truce. He merely shrugged, as though a broken peace was a small thing. "So, if one truce fails, why buy another?" he asked. "Because I have a quarrel with Gorfithid," Arthur replied, adopting the Saxon's blunt manner, "and I seek your help in that quarrel." Egil nodded. "But if I help you destroy Gorfithid, I make you stronger. Why should I do that?" "Because if you do not, then Gorfithid will destroy me, and he will then be stronger." Egil laughed, displaying a mouth of rotting teeth. "Does a dog care which of 2 rats it kills?" he asked. I translated that as, "Does a dog care which stag it pulls down?" It seemed more tactful, and I noted that Egil's interpreter, a British slave, did not tell his master. "No," Arthur allowed, "but the stags are not equal." Ael's interpreter said the rats were not equal, and I did not tell Arthur. "At best, Lord Ael," Arthur went on, "I preserve Dumnonia and make Powys and Siluria my allies. But if Gorfythid wins, he will unite Elmet, Chreged, Powys, Siluria, and Dumnonia against you." "But you will also have Gwent on your side," Ael said. He was a shrewd man, and quick. "True. But so will Gorfythid if it comes to a war between the British and the Saxons." Ael grunted. The present situation, with the British fighting amongst themselves, served him best, but he knew that the British wars would eventually cease. Since it now seemed Gorfythid must win those wars soon, Arthur's presence gave him a way of prolonging his enemy's conflict. "So, what do you want of me?" he asked. His wizards were now leaping up and down on all fours like human grasshoppers, while Nimue was arranging pebbles on the ground. The pebbles' pattern must have disturbed the Saxon sorcerers, for they began to utter small yelps of distress. Ael ignored them. "I want you to give Dumnonia and Gwent 3 moons of peace," Arthur said. "You're only buying peace?" Ael roared the words, and even Nimue was startled. The Saxon threw a gloved hand towards his warband that squatted with their women, dogs, and slaves beyond the shallow ditch. "What does an army do in peace? Tell me that, I promise them more than gold. I promise them land. I promise them slaves. I promise them Vilhas blood. And you give me peace?" He spat. "In the name of Thor, Arthur, I will give you peace. But the peace will be across your bones, and my men will take turns with your wife. That's my peace." He spat on the turf, then looked at me. "Tell your master, dog," he said, "that half my men have just arrived in boats. They have no harvest gathered, and no means to feed their folk through winter. We cannot eat gold. If we don't take land and grains, then we starve. What good is peace to a starved man?" I translated for Arthur, leaving out the more egregious insults. A look of pain crossed Arthur's face. Ael saw the look, translated it as weakness, and so turned scornfully away. "I will give you 2 hours' start, vermin," he called over his shoulder. "Then I shall pursue you." "Rat-eye," Arthur said, without even waiting for me to translate Ael's threat. The Saxon turned back. He said nothing, but just stared into Arthur's face. The stench of his bearskin robe was appalling, a mix of sweat, dung, and grease. He waited. "Rat-eye," Arthur said again. "Tell him it can be taken. Tell him it is full of all the things he desires. Tell him the land it guards will be his." Rat-eye was the fortress that protected Gorfythid's easternmost border with the Saxons. And if Gorfythid lost that fortress, then the Saxons moved 20 miles closer to Powys's heartland. I translated. It took me some time to identify Rat-eye to Ael, but at last he understood. He was not happy, for it seemed Rat-eye was a formidable Roman fortress that Gorfythid had strengthened with a massive earth wall. Arthur explained that Gorfythid had taken the garrison's best spearmen to add to the army he had collected for his invasion of Gwent and Dumnonia. He did not need to explain that Gorfythid had only risked that move because of the peace he believed he had purchased from Ael, a peace that Arthur was now outbidding. Arthur revealed that a Christian community at Rat-eye had built a monastery just outside the fort's earth walls, and the comings and goings of the monks had worn a passage through the ramparts. The fortress commander, he explained, was one of Gorfythid's rare Christians, and had given his blessing to the monastery. "How does he know?" Ael demanded of me. "Tell him I have a man with me, a man from Rat-eye, who knows how the monastery can be approached and who is willing to serve as a guide. Tell him I ask only that the man is rewarded with his life." I realized then who the stranger must be who had been walking with Hygwith. I realized, too, that Arthur had known he would have to sacrifice Rat-eye even before he left Donovaria.